So let's talk about what I consider one of the most underrated features on GoPro cameras. And that feature is exposure control, otherwise known as exposure lock. So exposure control is simply a way for you to prioritize a part of your frame where you would like it to be exposed properly. When using a GoPro normally it's going to average out the exposure from the entire frame. But there are a lot of use cases where you may not want that to happen. One good reason to use the exposure control feature is if you want to mix your GoPro footage into a project with footage from other cameras. Especially if you have footage from a mirrorless or a DSLR camera, it's going to help the GoPro footage mix a lot better. And that's because on a mirrorless or DSLR, unless you're using it in an auto mode, you're probably going to have a fixed exposure, and that's not going to change on you. If you haven't set that part of the frame where you want the exposure to be locked, when you move your GoPro around, the lighting is going to change. The exposure is going to be changing constantly, and the GoPro is going to be changing the shutter speed or some other variable to account for that. But when you prioritize a part of your frame by locking the exposure there, it's not going to change when you move your camera around. There are a lot of scenes where using this are going to be very useful. A couple examples would be a sunrise or sunset. There's going to be a lot of differences in lighting. The ground's going to tend to be darker, and the sky is going to tend to be much brighter. But depending on how your GoPro is angled, it could make the sky look really washed out, and as a result, you could miss out on some of those key details of a sunrise or sunset. And another instance would be if you are indoors looking out a window, it's going to tend to be blown out on the outside, but on the inside is where the GoPro is going to tend to prioritize the exposure. So sure, if you want the exposure prioritized inside, your GoPro is probably going to do a great job with that. But if you want what's going on outside the window prioritized, you're going to want to use the exposure lock feature. Now, the exposure control feature is super easy to use, and I'm going to show you how to use that. And then after I show you, we're going to head outside, and I'm going to shoot several different examples of me using this in the field, so you can see exactly how I use this and exactly how it looks. We have the camera set to 5.3K 24. You can have it set to any of the resolutions or frame rates, and this feature will still work. So all you have to do to use the exposure control is touch the screen and hold down. And when you do, you're going to see the box with the brackets come up. You're going to see 4 brackets on each side of the square, and it's going to say auto exposure at the top. So wherever you want to prioritize the exposure for the frame is where you want to drag this. So I'm going to just drag it down here. I want to prioritize the exposure right here in the bottom center of the frame. And once you've chosen where you want to prioritize the exposure, you're going to click in the middle of these brackets, and you're going to see the lock symbol. So a final step you need to do in order to ensure it stays locked is you need to select the check mark. So the exposure is now going to stay locked right there. You could move the camera around. You could do other things like start recording or stop recording, and it's still going to stay locked right there until you cancel it. And the way you'll cancel it is all you have to do is touch and hold down on the lock. And that cancels it and resets it back to the auto exposure. So something to note is you can also set this while you're recording. I'm going to cancel out of this here and I'm going to start recording. So right now it's recording on the auto exposure. There's no special exposure set. So if I want to set the exposure, let's say I want to set it down here, the lower left, I'm going to click and hold. There's our box. So I'm going to move the box around, and I want to choose to prioritize exposure in that part of the frame. So I'm going to click in it, set the lock, and hit the check mark. And I did all of that while it was still recording. And here's the other thing, while it's still recording, you can also cancel it. I'm going to hold down and cancel. You can select a different spot to prioritize. I'm going to prioritize right there where the light is. And I'm just going to click here, put the lock, hit the check mark, and there we go. The exposure has been prioritized in a different part of the frame while it's recording. I'm going to cancel that. And by the way, something I want to mention here really quick. If you click and hold at the center of the frame, it's going to come up with spot meter. So spot meter is very similar to exposure control, but it's a little bit different. Spot meter is technically something that's been around on GoPros going way, way back. To the very first GoPro, there was spot meter available. But spot meter is a more limited version of exposure control because you're limited to the very center of the frame for setting your exposure, and you can't move it around. Once you move it outside of the center, it then becomes the broader exposure control box. So I wanted to mention that in case you do click in the middle of the screen, because that can be a little bit confusing. So see, if I move it back to the exact center of the screen, that's where it has spot meter. And spot meter is more limited because you're limited to just what's at the very center of your display. You're not able to select other areas here, like when you do this. The GoPro Hero 5 and newer is when exposure control was introduced, but GoPro did still keep the spot meter on all of the GoPros, including the Hero 10. And if you have a GoPro older than the Hero 5, you're only going to have the spot meter option available. You're not going to have the broader exposure control option available.
And in the case of this scene, I actually really like that when the ground is properly exposed. I think it makes everything else look great. But let's see what it looks like if we remove that, and then if we prioritize up here toward the sky. All right, so what that does is that makes the ground look a little bit more shadowy and darker, but it makes the sky look brighter. And I'm gonna move a little bit with the camera here too, so you can see what that looks like as I move. So as you can see, when we move along here, this does maintain that exposure lock. It's prioritizing that similar part of the scene, and it's got the ground darker. When I'm going through the trees here, I think it's best to prioritize the ground because those are closest to the camera and will look best. When I'm not going through the trees, I kind of like prioritizing the sky.
When he comes up to the stream and throws rocks in. Because the default, if I clear this, where it averages out the frame, he looks a little washed out. So I definitely like it better when I properly expose that part of the frame manually. So basically what you want to do when you're properly exposing a part of the scene is you want to prioritize which part of the scene you want to look best. So in this case, I think it makes sense to prioritize the subject in the scene. And my subject, my son throwing rocks, is going to be right near the center. So that's where I'm going to click, put the spot meter there, click and lock it, click the check mark. So now when he steps up again to throw a rock, it's going to be properly exposed there. Looks really good. And it's also great to do when you're in like a slow motion mode like this. So while I may want him highlighted, I may also want the rocks hitting the water highlighted. So I'm going to pick an exposure spot right about in here to properly expose. I'm going to lock it, click the check mark. So now when he throws the rocks, we should get a pretty good view of them as they hit the water there. Go ahead. All right, so for this one, we're gonna first try prioritizing the exposure of the sky, and then we're gonna try the ground. This will show you what a difference it can make. So we're gonna tap up here for the sky. I'm gonna lock it, tap the arrow. That's what it looks like with the sky prioritized. When you have interesting clouds in the sky like today, if there's nothing on the ground that is your subject, or even if there is a subject and maybe you want the subject a little darker and more shadowy on the ground, and you want the sky properly exposed, this definitely looks great. Let's tap this to remove that prioritization. And then let's prioritize the ground now. So as you can see, when I prioritize the ground, the sky looks quite a bit more washed out. It's not bad, but the ground definitely gets the prioritization, and the sky definitely looks much whiter with less detail. And I really encourage you to try this out on your GoPro. It can give you some really fabulous results, and it can help you take your GoPro footage to the next level. And until we talk again, happy GoProing.